Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure and delight of speaking with Cadell last, Philosophy Portal. And today we're going to be talking about the newest Philosophy Portal publication, Abyssal Arrows. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, spiritual leadership inspired by Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I had the pleasure of being the editor of the text. Cadell was the teacher, and the lectures are magnificent. He also, on his channel, Philosophy Portal, Cadell's channel, YouTube, he has some of the conversations or some of the opening reflections that led into the course that I highly suggest. And I must say, it is extraordinary. I read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, oh goodness, wow, 13 years ago or something like that. And it's amazing when you come back to a text at a different phase of your life. This was one of the first things I was thinking about. I think when I was younger, I did not understand the concerns of Zarathustra because I was reading it as someone who was almost heading toward the mountain, if you will, to stay in the cave. And Zarathustra starts already there and kind of comes down. And it's so interesting when you read a book later in life where things that weren't really standing out to you or something that really concerns you suddenly do. And you suddenly see the genius in it and the text comes alive. And also that puts a fire in you to read the text, to write on the text, and to really dive into it, which then, of course, Cadell, your lectures always are so inspiring. And for me, that's really what education should be, like inspiring. Like when you see a lecture on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it should not make you go, oh, great, now I don't need to read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. What it should do is make you, oh my gosh, I need to go read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And on that, I'll have to say, Mr. Barnes was here, Samuel Barnes, and he's in the collection he submitted. He made a distinction between a book that describes and a book that that brings alive, like a book that describes and a book that kind of enlightens, that kind of makes it kind of the text comes. And he was saying that most academic texts are ones that just kind of describe the book. Where in here, there's kind of, when you read Abyssal Arrows, one of the things that is just so wonderful from all the contributors is you start seeing ideas that you never thought of in the context of Nietzsche, that then makes you want to go to the text and brings the text alive. So one, I have to compliment all the contributors to submitting essays that brought Nietzsche alive, that made it so that you saw Nietzsche in a new way, that made you want to go back to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which one I think speaks to the power of this new kind of book almost, this new kind of academic text that's kind of an anthology where you're freeing people to pursue the things that to chase their own fire, to pursue their own fire. And I think you also see the magnificence of the kind of essays that can be written when people pursue their own fire, and how that also inspires you to go back to the original text. So if I were to ask you, Cadell, having both you and I as readers of the text and of the book, what are some of the things that just pop out at you about this kind of work, these kinds of essays, maybe some of the themes that came up, maybe some of the ideas, or just the overall experience of reading a book like this and what it says maybe about the book? I know you had that wonderful conversation at Parallax on what is a book. I always enjoy listening to Mr. Sweeney and Tom speaking, and like what this says about what the book can do and what the book should do and what the book really the kind of role it should have in intellectual life today, which I think is very important. So as always, Cadell, it's great to speak with you.
Fantastic. Great start. And yeah, great to be here on OG Rose. And thank you for all the work that you put in on Abyssal Arrows to help this come to life. You've been very helpful every step of the way, and I really appreciate that. So yeah, thank you so much. And I really like your opening reflections on the age thing. I mean, a book is not really, what is a book, right? A book is not necessarily conceivable as just an objective physical reality which we can think about independent of the way we come to it as a subject, right? And of course with Nietzsche, he has a, oddly enough, there is a certain stereotype that actually young, maybe men in their late teenage years or in their early 20s will come to Nietzsche or come to Zarathustra and get really excited about some of the ideas that he's exploring there. But, funny enough, I think that actually as someone who started coming to Nietzsche and someone who started coming to Zarathustra in my mid-30s, I'm kind of, I almost feel lucky that I came to it at the time and the age that I did, because I feel like at least in my interpretation of the book, was able to see certain implicit dimensions in the work which are often overlooked when you just read the explicit message of the book. And at least in regards to my contributions in Abyssal Arrows, that's what I tried to bring out. But and maybe it does have some specific relationship to this metaphor of going up the mountain or coming down the mountain. I certainly come to Thus Spoke Zarathustra in a way where I am coming down the mountain more than I'm going up the mountain. And I think that might be a critical distinction in regards to interpreting the book and understanding Zarathustra's point of view. Obviously, at the very start of the book and in the summary on Amazon, we sort of emphasize, Zarathustra is a downgoing. He's a downgoing to humanity. He's got a full cup in the mountain, and he's emptying himself to come down the mountain. And so, of course, that metaphor in the context of my life might be seen along the lines of going up the mountain of academia and then coming down the mountain of academia. And that does, at least in my concrete experience, involve a certain emptying. And that's actually connects our origin point and meeting, because I started exploring lack. And then we had a little philosophical conversation series about lack, which at least in terms of my initiative with that, was inspired by my experiences of emptying and down going. So there's an interesting connection there. Yeah, so the anthology, I mean, of course, there have been anthologies, and the anthology is not necessarily a new type of book, but I do think that there is something that's going on here with Philosophy Portal, which is pushing the boundaries of something new. And I want to say that sort of, humbly or tentatively, because, who really knows if it's genuinely new, but but certainly what it is concretely is a collection of minds, spirits, hearts, and bodies that are pursuing their own fire and encouraged to pursue their own fire. Of course, in relationship, there are, it's not like there's no constraints. The constraint is there's a certain deep philosophical engagement with a specific text, which is the constraint. And but outside of that, how you approach the text, I mean, positively or negatively, you want to expand the text, you want to engage other Nietzsche's work, you want to throw in a different philosopher, you want to have a critical view of Nietzsche, right? Like there's critical views in Nietzsche in the anthology as well. So this is not a constraint in terms of I'm banning any topic ideas or anything like that. I'm kind of genuinely interested in what the community mind, so to speak, is expressing in relationship to the course, in relationship to the text itself, in relationship to where they are genuinely at with their own philosophical path, right? Whether that might lead to an essay which is discussing Girard, whether that's related to an essay which is bringing in evolutionary theory, whether that's in relationship to someone who wants to make a connection with Jesus, or whatever the content might be. All of that is really open-ended and encouraged, and really, like, the core is speculative cognition, is encouraging what does it mean to pursue that fire. Well, what it means to pursue that fire, to me anyway, is to really encourage and foster and create spaces to bring speculative cognition to the forefront. That people feel comfortable, because in typical university environments, you might feel Like there are a lot of people could go through a discipline without ever really testing their own ideas or being encouraged to test their own ideas. So I think that's really important. And I was reflecting in the Parallax podcast a little bit about if, let's say, like hypothetically, like Philosophy Portal's still young, it's like 18 months old or something like that. If you, say, for example, spend 2-3 years taking courses, writing papers, engaging in the community, and so forth, well, I realize now that what you'll have at the end of that engagement is something like the equivalent of a doctoral thesis, because a doctoral thesis is basically in academia seen as 3 standalone papers which you've published in journals, which have been through peer review, and which you can string together as a thesis and you can publish. So that's, I mean, at the end of, let's say, 3 years of work, you know, there are a lot of students in Philosophy Portal who will have the equivalent of a doctoral thesis. And that's incredibly special. That's incredibly important, is that what's going on is you know, these processes, these, and also it's interesting, you know, like we do need, I really, really want to emphasize, we do need to have boundaries and distinctions as it relates to teachers, students, and these relationships. And I think that still does need a little bit of thought and more work, because those boundaries do have a place, and those boundaries do have an importance. But at the same time, I do think that it's nice that there is also a deeper connectivity between teachers and students. And that comes with certain intimate emotional dimensions, which perhaps in traditional academia they have guarded against and not thought through, in regards to transference dynamics, in regards to what does it mean to really birth a philosophical mind? What does it mean to really, you know, like, for example, like, you know, does academia know really what to do with Nietzsche practically, in regards to what does it mean to really birth someone like a Nietzsche, or birth someone like the idea of Zarathustra? I mean, these are very radical figures, and these are really, you know, playing with radical ideas. So, you know, I think that at least what I see, I mean, it's still early days. We're still dealing with seeds, and we're still dealing with early sprouts, so to speak, to use the metaphor of the seed. But we're cultivating an environment where deep, long-term conceptual mediation can occur, and relationships between teachers and students can develop. And I think that's incredibly important. And I want to say just finally that we have to make a distinction between the type of stuff that goes on in social media, like philosophy on social media, whether that's Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and actual courses and projects and writing, you know, book projects, right? Like you need to go through those deeper, long-term conceptual mediations, and you do need to have some sort of relationship to people. At least for me, in my development, I've always sort of made a point to develop and cultivate relationships with older men who are further along, and who inspire me. And I couldn't have gotten where I am without that mediation. I think that's an integral part, and it's a shame, and I can imagine as a young man how difficult it might be to build or simulate those relationships in an online context. And so that's interesting. And then just final thing I'll say before passing it back to you is that you know, what can the book do? What should books do? What role should they serve in intellectual life? I mean, I think for me, my base level experience has been when I was producing my doctoral thesis, and I thought that when it was published, something would happen. I thought when it happened, it would be like someone would read it, or you know, something would move, something would shake. It's like, oh, because, you know, you put 6 years and then nothing happens. You know, ultimately nothing really happened. And so I think in my experience with books since then, it's books on their own are kind of empty. Books on their own are kind of just abstract results. but they have to be somehow embedded in either physical events or different types of performative rituals. Like I'm brainstorming right now. In what ways could we bring Abyssal Arrows to life? Right, in physical events, in performative rituals. I think that's something I really want to experiment with Abyssal Arrows, and it's like it's more than just the publication of the book. Like, okay, the book is published, it's out. But I think we also have to think about more than just the publication of the book. We have to think about, okay, now how do we keep the book alive, right? Can we do events? Can we do like I said, can we build containers where the authors of the book can engage with each other, push conversations deeper, birth new projects, birth new ideas? There's a lot of interesting ideas in here. So yeah, that's kind of where my thoughts are right now.
Well, that was all magnificent. So, a few things. First off, before I forget, Jason did such an amazing job on the cover. So shout out to Jason, friggin' rocks. And I also love the title because I was thinking about like when Abyssal Arrows. So it's, arrows you're shooting out of the abyss because the abyss actually empowers you to fly. It could be, you go down fighting. As you fall into the abyss, you're still fighting. But then also I like the idea that it's precisely the abyss that proves to be a place that can help us fly, that can help us soar forward. And, where the abyss is actually like Christopher Wyman has that essay collection he calls My Bright Abyss. And the idea that the abyss has a brightness to it. And if it was truly nothing, as in purely an effacement, it couldn't be bright. But the fact that it can compel us to be kind of soaring like arrows means that maybe it's an abyss because it's more apophatic, meaning there's a depth there that thought cannot fully access, but experience can. But once you contact it, you see what it is, and that actually compels you, that kind of motivates you. And one of the things that's very interesting when you talk about the book, there is something about a book that actually seems to be something about this. You only can really get it with experience, and you encounter it at different phases of your life that then makes it come alive and compel you in a way, like this kind of abyssal arrow in a way. It makes me think, we tend to not think of books. Like when I look at a book, we don't tend to look at it and say, oh, this is a young man's book. Oh, this is a midlife book. This is the end of life book, right? We tend to think that basically all books, because people go to college between the ages generally of 18 and 30. So in our heads, we say, oh, all books are for people between the ages of 18 and 30, right? And yeah, there's a ton of books for that. But a book like Zarathustra really is speaking to midlife, later in life. And it is helping. Now, it entails insights that can help you early in life, but there's a really strong argument to be made that the lessons of Zarathustra are not going to make sense to you until midlife, right? But if you've been told your entire life that a book is something you can read at any point and gather the information, then let's say you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra when you were 18. You would never think there's reason to go back and read it again, right? So we've lost there's been a death of rereading. We don't read things again. And you could argue that a great book is precisely one that when you read again, it has this sort of aliveness to it. You go, oh my gosh, there's so much here I didn't see. Like one of the reasons religious texts are religious texts is that no matter how many times you read them, there's new things that come out of it, new things that come out of it, new things that come out of it. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that a book that cannot be reread or pass the test of rereading should just be an essay, or it should be a summary, or it should be a paragraph. And I can't help but think that in the age of ChatGPT, that books that can't be reread or pass the test of rereading are going to go away. And really what you're going to see is the book, which the truest form of the book for me is precisely an entity that is always new in the rereading. A good, another example of this is like The Works of Love by Kierkegaard. I read that when I was younger. Read it again. It's like, oh my gosh, I missed everything. I've read The Brothers Karamazov. I try to read that once every 2 years. And every time I'm like, oh my gosh, how'd I miss that? Things come alive. And I think what's interesting, the question becomes the following. What makes somebody write a book that can be reread? Like what makes someone write a book that can be reread? I think it has something to do with writing according to the fire. There is something that writing accord the fire is there precisely in a person because it's almost like there's something apophatic, like that void that you can only know in the experience, that's trying to be articulated into thought, that thought has not been able to capture without the conceptual mediation or the work of trying to capture it and following it. And when you follow it, then you write a text that has a fire in it or traces of that fire that then can spread to the reader and light something in them. And the thing that it may light is precisely something that they didn't know about until midlife. And so it wasn't until midlife that that fire could resonate with them. And now it resonates with them. And really, when you read something that provides you a framework to understand something in your life so you can better work through it, that is an incredibly practical tool. In fact, it's truly a great gift when you read something that helps you get a hold on something you didn't understand, because now you can work through it and now you can actually absorb it into your life and make it part of you and change your horizon of experience. And it seems to me that the probability of a text or a book to do that is going to have a lot to do with if people are allowed to chase their fire, right? And often you see fires too don't need 200 pages. Maybe they need 20 pages. Maybe they need 5 pages. Maybe they need 10 pages. But say in the publishing industry, you're forced to write 250 pages. So a lot of books come out that are very fluffy. You can read the intro, the conclusion, in the middle, and you're basically done. A lot of the New York Times bestsellers. Or you have the pressures of academia with a certain word count. Oh, and by the way, you have to write on something that the professor is familiar with or else they can't grade it. Like the problem of grading also forces a certain narrowing of what the topic is about so that the professor can grade it, right? But then, of course, the likelihood that people being able to write on their fire goes down if they're forced to do such a thing. And I also think in some respects, letting people chase their fire has something to do as well with the with this problem of hierarchy or like saying everyone has the same level of expertise on a text. Because clearly, like, you teach the text, you know, you're the teacher of the Thus Spoke Zarathustra course. But then once you get to the anthology and say, you know, for example, I don't know a lot about tarot, the tarot cards, and Mr. Sweeney did that work on the Hanged Man, the Hermit, where he talked about all those things. And what that does is he goes off in a direction to talk about something I don't know anything about. And so automatically there's a sort of equaling, because everyone is teaching everyone something, but you got to that place where everyone had something to teach to one another precisely because there was a leader, right? Like you're leading the course, you lead them to that place, and then everyone's allowed to pursue their fire. So then everyone becomes a kind of expert in that fire that they pursue. So it's interesting to see here a possible kind of model of how to deal with this problem of authority, where authority can bring people to a place where then if everyone's allowed to pursue their fire, then everyone's like, oh, wow, they brought something to the table I would have never thought to bring to the table. I would have never written a paper on the tarot. I would have never written that paper about Heidegger that Thomas Wynne wrote. I would have never done what Pamela did on arrows. But now that you have, I've learned something. So then it feels like everyone has authority, but you got there, you earned the place of not having authority per se. Like you earned the place where there wasn't a hierarchy precisely because you had a leader, a teacher to lead you to that place. And I think a lot of academia today is trying to say, no, there's no teacher. All the students have something to say. No, you have to earn that space. You have to get to that place. But then that's like at the end of the year and you're not allowed to pursue your fire. You have to pursue like what the professor tells you to pursue, what their interests are. So precisely, and it's almost like the exact opposite. The professor the whole time is like, no, dude, you know, I have something to learn from all of you, which is when actually he should be leading or she should be leading. And then at the end of the year is when everyone should pursue the fire. And that's exactly when it's like, nah, you can't pursue your fire. You have to talk about within this narrow range. So it's the exact opposite in my mind of what needs to occur. And I think this text speaks to different ways to think about the problem. It speaks to the issue of where a book needs to be something that's rereadable. It speaks to how people should be free to pursue their fire, whatever that looks like, however many words that would look like. Because if you don't do that, because a book that consists of, in my opinion, 20 essays of people pursuing their fire, that is more likely, funny enough, even though it's a collection of essays, that's actually far more likely to be a book, precisely because it becomes something that you can reread the rest of your life and get something out of it. Whereas a lot of books that really should just be an essay in an anthology like this end up being something you read once. And precisely because it is not in a concert with other fires, then it doesn't really reward you upon the rereading. So I think it structures itself in favor of something that's more likely, in my opinion, to be like Zarathustra, which is really something, and I guess my last point, and then I'll give it back to you. We tend to think that a book, so Zarathustra is something that comes alive as you gain more experiences, right? It's not where you gain more intellect. It's where you gain more experience. We've been led to believe that if you read, say, Hobbes as a first-year college student, and then you read it again as a fourth year, you'll get a better reading because you gathered more intelligence, right? You've gathered more data. No, the great books are not things that like you can read and get that rereading for more intellect. You may get a better reading, but the power of the rereading is only something that comes with age, I think, and time. But then if in like you're taught in Western society that you read in college and that's when you get all your reading, and then the rest of your life you don't really read anymore. Everyone kind of said, no, lifelong learning, lifelong learning. Yeah, okay, John. Yeah, lifelong learning. Okay. People don't do that, generally speaking, which then creates the impression that a book can be fully understood at basically when you're a kid or when you're younger, right? And as long as you gain enough intellect, you'll be able to read a book correctly, right? And there's no reason why, if it's just a matter of intellect instead of experience, then theoretically, at any age, you could gain that intelligence, right? But if we're talking experience, then it is theoretically not possible to gain that experience except through life, right? Especially when you talk about midlife experience, elder experience, and so on and so forth. Well, if it is the case that great books cannot be fully understood without gathering the experiences, then there are many books that cannot be fully understood except later in life. And we have an education system that basically trains people to think that you can read books any point in your life. And that's what ends up happening. And I think ultimately what we see here, and then I'll give it back to you, really for lifelong learning to occur, people do need some sort of communal or institutional relation, because that inspires them, that helps them find new angles. And mostly basically for everyone, even if you get a PhD, that eventually ends. The current academic structure basically has ended, which that kills the relation that people seem to need, that I know I need, or that inspires me, to engage in lifelong learning. And if indeed there are many books that only can be fully understood at different phases of life, then there are many books that can only be understood if there is lifelong learning. You see what I'm saying? And I think this might be one of the reasons why we basically seem to have not read The Science of Logic. It seems like we haven't as a society read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, doesn't it? It kind of feels like there are these great books we haven't even read. Maybe part of that is because there has not been ways to truly create processes of lifelong learning. But now that we have something like the internet, that might be possible, faster internet with Zoom. And so then the question is figuring out what that may look like. And if we can figure that out, I think then actually reading these classic books for once in history maybe might actually be possible. And I see anthologies like that, like this, in service of that effort.
Okay, so there's a lot there. So yeah, I want to emphasize first sort of what you're talking about with the title Abyssal Arrows, linking sort of the abyss to flight and brightness, is that, you know, the type of language or the type of words that I find myself gravitating towards are, you know, like for example, on the Stoa, when I was presenting with some collaborators on the concept of dark renaissance, is that it's a weird word which combines the negative and the positive. Like, so it's not just positive, it's not just negative. It's a weird unity of the positive and the negative, or what we usually think of as the positive and negative, like dark and light, you know, something dark, something light. You know, and you know, it's hard not to bring up, you know, the way Hegel in The Science of Logic talks about the fact that, you know, pure darkness and pure brightness are the same thing. It's like, and also the same level of unintelligibility. Like, you don't learn anything from pure light, and you don't learn anything from pure dark. That you need to have some sort of weird unity between the two to learn something. And I'm trying to go at something similar there with the title of Abyssal Arrows, and also the link between the abyss and brightness, to me that invokes a metaphor that I like playing with, the metaphor of the black hole, which is that even though a black hole is black from the external point of view, actually, if you learn what a black hole is, it's actually probably the brightest thing possible on the inside, of course. Of course, and you don't want to be on the inside of a black hole, right? But there is this paradox at work in the black hole where, from the external point of view of cognition, it's black and dark, but from the internal point of view, God forbid, it would be the brightest thing possible. So there is something about that. And also the black hole is interesting because it sort of suspends laws of physics, which might give you the idea of flight, like, oh, I could fly, the laws of physics have been suspended. There is something like that going on in the title of Abyssal Arrows there. And so I wanted to quickly note that. Yeah, I mean, I do think that Thus Spoke Zarathustra, you can get something from Thus Spoke Zarathustra at 20. You can get something from Thus Spoke Zarathustra at 30, 40, and 50. And I think probably you're going to get something different from Thus Spoke Zarathustra at all of those ages, again, sort of emphasizing the subject in the way in which the subject engages with the object. And of course, that can, in some sense, trivially or superficially be said about many texts, but there is something about the deepest or the greatest works in philosophy, and in particular this book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which I think lends itself to these types of rereadings more than other texts. One, because it's weird in the sense that it's a philosophical fiction, so it's a story, and it's at the same time fictional, and at the same time it's a philosophical form. It's accepted as a part of the philosophical canon, and that already makes it kind of strange. But also, like, I tried to do calculations while I was teaching the book because it's not stated explicitly. I was really focused on some of the implicit meanings in Thus Spoke Zarathustra when I was teaching it. And one of those implicit meanings was that actually Zarathustra, you get almost like a snapshot of a story or a cognition that goes from about 30 years of age to about, by my calculations, maybe about 60 years of age. So at different parts of the book, Zarathustra is at different ages. And those are not precise calculations. And again, you never find out the exact age, but it's, you do see someone who's developing over decades in his thought about his own spiritual process. So I think that can lend itself to creative rereadings. Like, I'm always, like, the first time I read the fourth part, I'm pretty convinced I didn't get it. And then after I read it a few times, it became deeper and deeper. And, specifically the fourth part is like, what am I going to think about that when I'm 60? Like, I'm sure my interpretations of it will change and evolve with my age. But yeah, in regards to some of the other authors and the diversity here on offer in Abyssal Arrows is, yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot from this whole process and all of the fantastic contributions. And I just want to say that I'm always blown away with the quality and the level of the contributions that we receive. But when you have someone like Thomas Wynne bringing in Heidegger, when you have someone like Andrew Sweeney talking about the tarot cards, like you mentioned, yeah, I mean, I have little expertise. I'm not an expert on either of those topics, but there are so many aspects of what they brought to the table, which I've actually already started citing those two papers. I'm actually working on a paper where I've cited both of those works, and I found myself thinking about the relationship, for example, between becoming and letting in Thomas Wynne's work, and I've just been playing around with these concepts more, and they've been sinking in. So it's certainly a situation where there's genuine bidirectional learning. And again, that's not something necessarily I anticipated, but it is something that has emerged. And that's sort of a feature of a lot of the things that have gone on at Philosophy Portal, is that a lot of things have emerged which I didn't necessarily plan to go that way. but they have emerged that way, and so whenever that happens, I see that as a good sign, because it's more that I'm trying to set the constraints in such a way as that something will happen that's interesting, which will surprise me. And of course, you can have good surprises and bad surprises, but if you can set the constraints in such a way as that something emerges which is a positive surprise, I think that's a really good sign that you're building something interesting. So and that keeps happening. So I'm happy about that. A few more points there. I think it's important to bring up in regards to the age, the emphasis you were having on age, and specifically the power of the rereading with Zarathustra in particular, is that again, in the science of logic, Hegel emphasizes that it's only through experience that one starts to clue in to the importance of the relation between universality, particularity, and singularity, and specifically moving from universality to singularity. And what's interesting about Thus Spoke Zarathustra is that what you're getting there is a window into a very intimate and precious singularity. And I think that's what's so special about Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is that Zarathustra is a singularity, and a singularity in the sense that Zarathustra is not to be mimicked or duplicated. Like, we don't need to all behave like Zarathustra. And that would be going against the point. It's crazy wisdom, if you like. It's crazy wisdom in the sense that it's a repetition which is precisely not repeatable. He has some fantastic lines in the third part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where he's talking about walking up mountains with footprints that could never be followed. Like, he's walking like metaphorically, he's climbing a terrain that you can't walk that path, right? He's walking an unrepeatable path, and I think that's pointing to this logic of singularity, which paradoxically, and this again brings us back to the logic, is that singularity feeds back into universality. So singularity gives birth to universality as well. And I think that's something that's an underrated aspect of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is that we're getting a singular myth, which I think, it's interesting. Like, something that captures my attention is, if we study the singular myth of Jesus and we study the singular myth of Zarathustra and situate them within their historical context, what those myths are trying to communicate to us, right? We do get something with a universal power, right? And I think actually the proof of that, as it regards to the proof of that with Christianity, is self-evident, like the history of Western civilization. The proof of that with Zarathustra, I think, is, and that's something I try to make a case for because it's obviously only a century or so old, is that the proof of that with Zarathustra is, I think, 20th century philosophy. Like 20th century art and 20th century thought. I mean, I think following Daniel Tutt, who's a professor in United States on psychoanalysis, he's writing a book right now on Nietzsche, and he's making an argument in his book where he's saying we live in Nietzsche's world now. And I think that in some sense there's a truth to that. In other words, Nietzsche, or Zarathustra specifically as a singularity, has birthed a new type of universality. And I think that is, we should be thinking through precisely, and I try to point towards this a little bit in the book, is we should try to push towards thinking about the meaning of someone like Nietzsche or Zarathustra in a global level. Within the context of digital technologies and stuff like that, this is where we can do creative rereadings of Nietzsche and Zarathustra. And in fact, just to cite a few articles in Abyssal Arrows, which point in that direction, is that there's an article by Carl Hayden Smith, which I think is a good creative rereading of Nietzsche and Zarathustra in the context of humanism and transhumanism. And there's also a good article by Philip Lundstrom and David Hogberg as it relates to what they call the digital desert and the burning Overman, which is another interesting creative reading where they bring Zarathustra into the context of the liminal web, and they bring Zarathustra into the context of modern digital technologies. So again, those are things that emerged in the process, which I didn't anticipate would emerge, but they did, and they're positive surprises. And yeah, I think that's again, like I say, I'll end by saying, I think if you're setting the constraints for something and you're positively surprised by the results, that's a good sign you're setting good constraints in some sense. So it's not that you're focused on explicitly saying, this is what I want the result to be. It's more that you are saying, I need to set up some constraints so that we can increase the probability of good surprises.
I really like that idea of the teacher setting up the conditions of surprising the teacher positively. That seems to be getting at what needs to occur. Where in some respects, maybe I'm not, I haven't been to every institution, but I think in an institutional setting, surprise is a threat. Like a surprise, something that unveils the professor doesn't know something is a threat because the professor doesn't know something. Oh, why should we listen to him then? There's like a threat in the kind of unveiling that the professor is surprised by something when it's a true surprise as opposed to the performative, oh, I learned from all my students. But there's a kind of like script there, right? It's a kind of performative element where you're supposed to say that. And I'm not saying the professors secretly know they don't do that, but like to really, really learn, I think it has to be phenomenologically a surprise. Like you don't really learn when you hear something interesting. Like, it's like, oh, that's interesting. Is that really learning? In a way, but it's more like a collection of data. A surprise is when you go, oh, I'd never thought that. And that almost by definition requires students to bring something to the table that the professor is not familiar with. It has to be like really out of their realm to then surprise them, because it almost has to be, it's almost like the difference between the expansion of a world versus just adding something to a world. Like the professor has their world, they have their academic structure, and they're like, oh, the student added some details to my world my framework. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. But a surprise is when you go, whoa, there's like a different continent to this world. Oh, there's a door over there. What's through that door? And that seems to be, because the moment that happens and the professor's like, I've never been over there. And the student's like, well, I have. Well, now the roles are shifting. But the only reason the student can take the professor over there is because the professor or teacher created the conditions so that the student would make that door. So now we start seeing how we have leadership. Now we start seeing how we have distinction, and yet also then have not this kind of power hierarchy or something where the student doesn't actually learn. Because the thing is too, like when the student learns that they can surprise the teacher, well, then they start going, wow, I really can add value. Wow, I really can get something out of this. And now it starts moving to an intrinsic motivation. Now they start seeing the power of ideas. Now they start believing in themselves. And that goes a really, really long way. And that also mimics the kind of Zarathustra in the sense that now the student is going their own way, right? And other people can go with them. But then here's the thing. Let's say the student becomes the teacher and they're leading, there's going to be a point where even that student as a teacher will have to say, okay, now you go your own way and you show me your own unique door. And there's always this dialectical back and forth, where the teacher leads the student then takes the teacher somewhere new. Then that student has to go back to being a student as a new teacher takes over and over again. And I'm not sure. And I think that dynamic is way more difficult to do in the college academia structure, because what, is every student going to get their own class? Are they all going to get tenure every next year? Each student gets a tenure, and then the professor becomes a student. It's not structured for that, but we can see that here, and that seems to be what's needed for this kind of new way of thinking through doing philosophy, doing education, doing intellectualism, et cetera, so forth. Now a few more things. I also wanted to note, you mentioned the Dark Renaissance. I really enjoyed when Owen Raymond and Mr. Ebert, Alex Ebert, were talking about the wellness, Dark Renaissance, dark wellness on the store pretty recently. Everyone should go watch that. It was really great. And actually, that's really important because I definitely think the wellness, spirituality realm, I've seen a lot of people say, in Christianity that enter into the magical thinking. I've seen a lot of people that go down the secret road. I think it's very dangerous. And it actually goes to show you the necessity of the power of speculative reasoning or thinking of possibilities to lead people down roads that without conceptual mediation actually get them trapped, right? Like you can think, oh, what if like thinking manifests, right? Like you could imagine the possibility of thinking manifests. Well, suddenly that gets in service of, say, capitalist ideology and you don't realize it. And so what you see here in this way of doing academia online is this balance between conceptual mediation, but also speculative reason, and a place for people to follow their speculative reason to wherever it may lead, but then they have to write a paper defending it. Whereas very often in the culture, yeah, pursue your magical thinking, but you never have to write a paper or you never have to get it tested. You just go to the retreat, right? Well, here it's like, oh, okay, you think there's a relationship between Zarathustra and the Tarot? Okay, write it and present. That's very different from saying, oh, that's nice, Johnny, go pursue that off. You have to mediate it. And that, I think, is part of what's missing from the culture, because there's really a funny way where if you, as an education, as the schooling system, I know I'm using these terms interchangeably, if you as the intellectual institution of the day deny speculative reason, then people are still going to do it. They're going to end up in magical thinking now, to use that. They end up in magical thinking, and then they go off and end up in all those troubles of the dark, the wellness, the spirituality, and all of the trouble that's happening over there that Ebert, Owen, and Raven were talking about. But then at the same time, if you don't let people speculate at all, and they just have to stick to the professor's interpretation or the right interpretation of the text, well, then they don't get that fire, and then education dies. And so maybe they don't fall into magical thinking, but then they're dead inside, and they never become the self-turning wheel. So there has to be a way of institutionally, and in terms of the book, thinking about how to have, like with Hegel, dialectical thinking with speculative reasoning, and dialectical reasoning in service of speculative reasoning, and then speculative reasoning having to submit itself to conceptual mediation. And if we don't do that, well, then you get these pathologies that develop on different sides of it. And so I think that Stoa talk really was getting at a lot of important things. I'm now also wondering if a distinction could be drawn between deep reading and rereading, where maybe a deep reading is kind of more intellectual. Like, I don't think a book like Finnegan's Wake changes as you get older. It changes as you learn all of the moves James Joyce is doing, all the wordplay. So that's a more like deep reading. Maybe we could say deep reading is intellectual, whereas rereading, like Zarathustra, seems to be more experiential. So maybe there's a difference here. I don't think all books, like Finnegan's Wake, you certainly can read differently, but you read it differently because you get more intellect. Really, you really do. It's an intellectual text. Or maybe some of the William Absalom is definitely a deep reading text. But Zarathustra is a rereading text, and I'm just using that to talk about experience. And I think we only think in terms of deep reading. We don't have in our minds a category of rereading. And that's, I think, what we've been missing. That also gets missed because people don't tend to read books as they get older, at least in the West. The average person does not. And more importantly, if people do keep reading, they don't tend to reread. They tend to read new books or different books. Because why would I go back and reread that book? I already read it. Well, because there's a rereading element. It changes experientially. So I think that's, in order for the book to really prove why it matters, because there's this question like a parallax, why does the book matter? Why should book matters? Well, once you get the rereading, it's really clear why the book matters. And that also too, the distinction Mr. Barnes made is between elucidation and description. The difference between a book that elucidates and a book that merely describes. You get that difference in the rereading, because when you reread a book, suddenly Zarathustra elucidates your life. Suddenly something has been elucidated, where you get your life, and then also an anthology elucidates Thus Spoke Zarathustra, so that you go back to it and then you get how it applies to your life. But all of that requires a culture of rereading and believing the rereading, of which is tied to belief in the power of experience to change us, which is very different from merely deep reading, which is a matter of gathering more intelligence to kind of get the word plays and the tricks and things like that. So I think that's also something perhaps the online world can get to. Oh, and that also, I think the rereading, which is experientially based, Zarathustra is all about that, because, if you can't follow his footsteps, if at the end of the part one, he's like, you guys got to hate me, or else you really don't learn what I'm teaching you unless you hate me. He's saying you have to go your own way now, right? So even like in the design of the course, you teach people, you lead them through those Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and then you get to the conference and you're like, all right, now you have to hate me, basically. You have to hate my learning and compel yourself in your own direction. And that's exactly the kind of act that kind of aligns with Zarathustra, because there's a real sense. It's almost like one of the reasons the professor in traditional academia doesn't let you go your own way, because it's almost like it feels like, oh, you're forcing me to confront the tarot card. Oh, you're forcing me to confront Heidegger, like Thomas Wynne or Mr. Sweeney. It feels like an act of hate. Now you're making me go learn all about this so I can grade you. Now you're making me go learn all about that. It feels like a hateful act. And the professor's like, no, I don't want to submit myself to the negativity of feeling like I don't know the tarot or I don't know Heidegger. So I'm not going to let you do that. Where it is actually to be open to people bringing you things you haven't thought about would force the professor to undergo the negativity of not knowing something, which is precisely creating the space where everyone can learn from another and move, and it becomes elucidating as opposed to simply describing the text. Because there, like you're saying, that feeling of surprise. It's like, I really enjoyed Owen Cox's piece on A Message from Hell, where he's talking about how the serpent in so many kind of mystical traditions or Kabbalah is like in the Garden of Eden. The serpent is a necessary, and William Blake, he has that William Blake painting, where, we may not like what Nietzsche is saying. It might be a messenger from hell, but that actually is part of the realization of quote unquote divine providence or wisdom, or moving forward in ways to make us fully human beings that otherwise we could not be, right? Like I would have never connected Nietzsche with that tradition or some of the Kabbalistic thinking about the serpent. But then when Owen brings it out, you go, oh, wow, that's a really new thought. But unfortunately, it brings with it the feeling of, I want to go like really study all of Jewish mysticism, and I don't have that much time. And oh my gosh, there's this whole kind of horizon that I really want to go to explore, but I can't explore. And oh, maybe it would have been better if I didn't know about it, because then I wouldn't be tortured by this desire to learn about it. And there's a kind of negativity there that you have to accept and actually see, realizing there are these countries that you haven't explored but could explore, and dealing with the negativity of I know so little compared to all there is to learn. That's actually the kind of negativity that we see Zarathustra dealing with constantly, that if you don't deal with, then you shut yourself down, or you don't want someone to submit a paper that submits you to an entirely different territory, because you have to deal with the feeling of not knowing something, or there being a world that you may never have time to go into, because it is very difficult to be the kind of subject or person that says there are extraordinary worlds out there that I may never see. There's kind of a pain in that feeling, right? And yet being able to suffer that pain is also the prerequisite, I think, for creating the teaching environment where people pursue their own passions and create that fire for one another. That also helps us deal with these perhaps more pathological hierarchies in teaching. And then I also love where Thomas Hammelrick was talking about like, hey, this Nietzsche guy, this could be really problematic because he's unleashing humanity through, there's no kind of division in different periods of time, right? Like between ritual time or sacred time or the normal time, or a period of repression, a period of release. And what if Nietzsche is unveiling us to a period of entire release, right? And I like also how Owen and Hammelrick were talking to one another. I also think that's important for text, to actually show both sides and have a discussion between those different things, right? But just to even think about, oh, wait, what if I as a human being need both periods of holding back and releases? Oh, I like just living in a world where I could think I just need one or the other. I don't want to think about a world where I need both. How do I design my world, or think about my world, or think about society in providing both of those needs for the subject? Well, things get a lot harder, right? And you have to deal with that negativity to go forward with that. So you have so much from all these people like Owen or Thomas, or we mentioned, et cetera, so forth, to learn. But you also have to deal with the negativity of not knowing something, learning about something that you may never fully get to explore just because of time restraints, thus meaning that there are people out in the world. I actually think this is a feeling that traditional academia has done everything in its power to avoid, is the feeling of knowing there are people in the world who know things that you will never know to the depth that they know them. That's quite a hard pill to swallow, right? That really hurts the ego, right? And so we don't want to know that. And so we can tend to design publications and books so we can avoid that. Oh, and then in addition to knowing that, you also have to know that when it comes to going your own way, you can't simply follow an ancient book. Like basically all of Zarathustra is like, hey, at the end of the day, you're going to have to be your own Zarathustra. All I can be is a model. All I can show is what you need to do. But at the end, you can't follow these footsteps. You need to climb your own mountain. You have to deal with your own, someone one day saying, hey, man, like the still voice, like in part 4, where like it's like the higher man is looking for you, the higher man is calling for you, and Zarathustra's like trembling and perspiration, like, oh my gosh, the higher man, I gotta, like, I'm comfortable now, I have a kind of happiness, and now again in part 4, I've already done this so many times. Again, I have to go face something. Yeah, you take Zarathustra seriously, your entire life you have to keep facing something. And the example of letting people write things that unveil to you entire worlds that you will never fully perhaps explore is part of kind of the negativities we see Zarathustra going through. But if we can learn to do that, and in addition to that, understand that we have to go our own way, and all of the terror and all of the anxiety with that, then I think we're starting to frame, and then I'll give it back to you. Then I think we're starting to frame what education or academia today or in these online spaces needs to do. It needs to be a place that helps people be the kinds of subjects that can acknowledge there are people who know things they will never know, and to get excited by that, because then everyone actually becomes their own kind of Zarathustra, right? Everyone has their own world that they're bringing, and how wonderful it is to be in the midst of all these people that know things that I'll never get to know, and yet they're bringing me their life and their subjects. And then, wow, at the end of all of this, then I get to go on my own path that maybe no one else can go on, and I'm the only person that can ever go on that path. Well, there's one version of all that that's exciting, but then there's another version of all that that's terrifying, because that means you have to go alone. That means there are things you will never know. Zarathustra, kind of the phrase I always love that you use is flips the script, right? The fact that there are all these unknowns is suddenly wonderful, and it inspires you, and then it can help you go on your own path. But it would require us to make an educational environment that is in favor of all that, as opposed to suppressing all of that. And I definitely think Zarathustra is an example, and I think the anthology also speaks to that possible reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that Zarathustra is a figure who is trying to encourage people basically to he is in some sense a weird type of universal model, but he's certainly encouraging the direction of finding your own singularity, and even to the point where, of course, we have these famous sayings from both, I think, Zarathustra and Nietzsche about a student who never becomes a teacher fails to repay the teacher, or something like that. There is a dialectical reversal that will take place between teachers and students, and building all of that in institutionally, building all of that in practically, is extraordinarily difficult. And so that's sort of a meta. I would say, like, there are a few things that I encounter with Philosophy Portal that I would say are like meta problems or meta surprises, even, where it's like, depending on the size of the problem or depending on the size of the surprise, they do in fact threaten the entire structural underpinning of the enterprise. So, I think one of the ethical principles that I'm trying to work through and develop and think through is that when you build a project, you kind of have to build the dissolution of the project into the thing itself. So you're not building the project with the idea that it's just going to be like some sort of eternally reified structure, but you're building a project inclusive of the fact that one day you might have to dissolve the structure, or you might have to rethink the structure in such a way as that, everything changes. And certainly, the relationship between students and teachers and this issue of differentiation is, to me, a really important thing to think through. And actually, I have a kind of like self-hypothesis where my hypothesis about, and it's a hypothesis about myself, is that while I was in my most Deleuzian in terms of my embodied existence, I spent the most time studying Hegel. But then in terms of like in my embodied existence, I'm kind of like a rhizomatic multiplicity. But then I'm interested in Hegel while I'm a rhizomatic multiplicity. That if, or as it increasingly seems likely, if I start to get more grounding in a single location, then maybe that's the time where I'll start to read more Deleuze and study Deleuze more. So there's kind of like this reversal where maybe Deleuze needs to be understood in this way. Like from the point of view of someone who's has a quote unquote Hegelian grounding. So that's sort of, who knows what might happen in that direction, but I have a anticipation that something like that might occur. Yeah, so in regards to I think one of the crucial distinctions you were bringing up there was the deep reading plus the rereading, and the distinction there between the deep reading being conceptual and the rereading being experiential. I think we need to think about these as a loop, like a loop between like experience and concept. And yeah, I mean, I think there is this tendency. One of the big problems, I think, in a lot of post-Hegelian philosophy is, to actually privilege one or the other side of this loop, either the experiential or the conceptual. But we need to basically have the experiential and the conceptual in a sort of dialogue and a back and forth, I think. And it is certainly a crime that a lot of people do not do either deep readings or rereadings. So if we can build a culture which is sort of committed to both, that would be, a life worth lived if we could encourage a culture which does both. And yeah, also in regards to, I like the distinction that Samuel Barnes made between description and elucidation. And I think I brought up that distinction in the Parallax podcast to quote to him. And I do think that Abyssal Arrows is more of an elucidation. I think that Barnes was saying something like, when you read a typical academic text, it's kind of like people are just almost like marking signposts, making sure everything is cited properly, making sure everything is described accurately. And Abyssal Arrows is certainly not that. Like, if you want a complete description of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or like a specific commentary on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I think probably you should look elsewhere. But what you will get are, I think, elucidations of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and clearly papers that are inspired by the spirit of Zarathustra. And I think that's much more the direction that this book takes. And yeah, I mean, and there are also like little, I think, jewels and treats in this book. Like, for example, you brought up the relationship between Owen Cox and Thomas Hammerich. Like, some of the essays, and well, most of the essays are organized strategically and thematically, and in some sort of dialogue with each other. And that's in part related to the design of the peer review process that people are going through, is that the peer review process involves people trying to, as it were, collaboratively and cooperatively improve each other's works for a collective book. And so there are certain people who have read each other's work before they're published and are actually engaging in each other's work. And I think Owen Cox and Thomas Hammerich is an example of that, where, and also you have within the text, you have inner antagonisms, right? Like, so for example, there is an inner antagonism between Thomas and Owen, which, for example, would be interesting to bring to life, would be interesting to see further discussed, and that this would be related to the idea of, let's think about events, or let's think about performances where we can keep this book alive, and we can keep this book engaged with the future of our experience, right? Not just it's published and then it's over. And I do think, one of the things you were emphasizing there, to me, in regards to the professor or the teacher, in regards to being surprised or being challenged conceptually, is you say facing certain negativities, facing specifically negativity in terms of facing what I do not know, and things like that, and basically building up the emotional capacity to deal with that. And I think that, for me anyway, like that's sort of where I've always related to the idea of the self-relating negativity, which is not just I don't know, it's not egoic. I always see it as the opposite of egoic, is that you become comfortable with yourself, becomes comfortable with the negativity, Now you could, and we get into interesting ethical and philosophical challenges when it comes to this dimension of not knowing and this dimension of surprise. And like, I think just to bring it full circle, I would say that, in regards to what I'm doing with Philosophy Portal is, facing a negativity or facing a surprise, which potentially challenges the entire structure of what I'm doing, where I'm forced to like encounter a negativity or a surprise where I'd be like, maybe I have to change what I'm doing completely. Versus faith, and but like I am building that level of negativity or that level of surprise into the project. It's just, you have to make that decision as it, when you encounter it. But as it regards to sort of facing negativities or surprises which don't challenge like the overall structure, but are rather seen as positive, I think at this stage of Philosophy Portal, that's the best kind of surprise and that's the best kind of negativity. Because if you have the mind state that I am open to being surprised and I'm open to engaging with people who are going to share with me things I don't know, well, then I can engage with the process of sublation. Because basically on a sort of a manageable level of sublation, because ultimately what that would mean is that I'm challenging myself to include within myself, in some sense, lifting myself to a level which previously I wouldn't have been able to get to, or I wouldn't have been able to get to without the other. So I think that's, and also before I pass it back to you is, there's not like 10 commandments in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but there are certain ideas which read in this way when he's talking to the higher men. And one of those things which sticks out to me is that the higher you climb, the more likely it is that you could make mistakes, like catastrophic mistakes. And certainly that's something I'm trying to be. Well, you just have to be more and more aware of is that very small decisions, very small distinctions can lead to great falls and great mistakes. And, that's I think that's part of the idea of the Overman is that you build in such a way as that you're prepared for the fall of whatever you're building.
That was excellent. And it makes me think, Raymond, the great Raymond K. Hessel, has been doing readings of Thus Spoke Zarathustra on his channel. And he was bringing the point that we always, there's a lot of descriptions of Zarathustra as going down or looking down or down to the earth. Well, you can only kind of look down if you're high, right? And how there's always this element of being high, but high also means possibility of fall. And actually, I think that speaks to one of the things that you almost have to be older to understand, which is that often, like, it's not enough simply to say, oh, I intended for that to be good, or I intended things to work out. What you realize is that, like, it's almost like when you're young, you have to discern the difference between good and bad. But as you get older, you start have to discerning between like what seems good and what's actually good, or like good and excellent. And there are these kind of shadings. And if you get it wrong, it could be catastrophic. Like the stakes are really high. Like, this is the thing, like you come to realize that the stakes are high and the problems are gray. It's like the worst of all possible combinations. Like, it would have been great if when things were black and white, the stakes were high, because I could tell what was black and what was right. Like, when I could clearly see right and wrong, then it would have been fine if the stakes were high. But that's exactly when you were younger and the stakes tended to be lower. The irony is, as you get older, the stakes get higher and the problems get gray. And that is one of the things that Zarathustra, I think, is so often exploring or highlighting, that's one of the reasons you really can't get it until you're older, because you just haven't had experiences, or it's not as likely that you've had experiences where you had to make a decision in a gray circumstance and there was a catastrophic problem because of what you decided. And there's kind of an unfairness to it. Like, it's really kind of unfair because it wasn't like self-evident what you were supposed to do. And maybe you were the only one who was willing to make a choice and everyone else kind of pretended like it wasn't happening. And then you made the choice and it was wrong. And the mistakes were catastrophic. And then you get the game, if you will. Then you kind of get what life is about. Like, oh, this is life. This is the quote unquote game, if you will. Oh, this is a crazy game, like high stakes and great problems. Oh, really? And that's when you say, oh, I need to learn. oh, I need to like learn what is learning because I thought I knew what learning was, but my entire life I learned only the difference between good and bad. I didn't learn the difference between good and actual good or grace. I didn't learn grace. That's the thing. Like you go through education, and you suddenly start going, wow, I never learned the difference between shades of gray. I only learned the difference between right and wrong. And it turns out life is a thing where you need to know the difference between the shades of gray. And I think actually, honestly, as the world becomes more pluralistic, globalized, and complex, then the problems do tend to be gray. And maybe this is why we're seeing a hunger of people looking to get back to old texts, hunger for wisdom, revenge of philosophy, as you've talked about, precisely because more and more people, like maybe the average person, is realizing that it's high stakes and shades of gray. Well, in that circumstance, then you need to go to the great books, right? You need to really think freaking science of logic. You really need to think intellect and experience in a circle, in a relation with one another. I also, it makes me think too, a lot of what you were saying on the surprise, the negativity. It makes me think, on Cheaton's wonderful paper, where he was talking about entropy versus negotropy. I can never say this word, the opposite of entropy. And where he talks about whether we buy the reading or not. Thank you, sir. Where Zupancha is talking about Deleuze, and kind of the argument is that Deleuze uses multiplicity to avoid the real, right? So I think you have that distinction between, as you've mentioned on What is Sex, where there's realization in Deleuze, but not the real. Now, again, there may be Deleuzian scholars that disagree with that, or maybe it's no nuance, totally open to that. But just to make the point, is that it's kind of interesting because in Cheaton's paper, there's the suggestion that the only way to get the negentropy, I heard you say it and still can't say it. Say it one more time for me, Cadell. I'm sorry.
Negentropy.
Negentropy. Wow, these Virginian accents. Negentropy. The only way to get negentropy is to face the real of the subject, whereas our tendency is to avoid the real in favor of maybe realization, which then ultimately tends to fall into a problematic repetition that then leads into entropy. And there's a problem then where you can kind of enjoy the realization, which is ultimately leads into entropy, where it's almost like if you don't face the real, you're not going to get the negentropy. I still can't say negentropy. Whereas if you fall into avoiding the real, you actually then have to, because then that's going to be entropy, it's going to lead to entropy. You have to enjoy the entropy or find mechanisms of enjoying the entropy because you denied facing the real. And so then you have to engage in all the gymnastics where you enjoy the entropy, right? And all of that. So it's like the choice, it's almost like what we see, and I really enjoyed Cheaton's paper. That's another example of an extremely important work. Like the choice that Zarathustra gives us is face the real, and then there's the possibility of negentropy, life, or deny the and give into the temptation of realization, which I think we see that like going back to what they were saying at the Stoa. There's a like the wellness industry, the spirituality, all of that is realize, manifest, true self. And the danger of all that, of course, is then in that language of realization, in that danger of spirituality, you don't actually face the real, you're actually engaging in entropy, but then you have to somehow enjoy that entropy or avoid or not look at that entropy. And believe that you're actually adding negentropy to the world. I really should have been careful to talk about Cheaton's paper if I can't pronounce the word, right?
You could say negentropy.
Negentropy. Thank you, sir. This would be an example of facing the negative of a person facing the negativity of their inability.
Performative aspect.
Yeah, and then I have to ask if I'll keep this in the recording or cut it. So this is an example of now it's status anxiety, like Ebert, burn your status, like he did at the store. So in honor of you, Alex Ebert, I'm going to keep this. What's a weird
word?
It is. No, it is. Thank you, sir.
It is a weird word.
In honor of Alex Ebert, I'm going to keep this in the recording so everyone can see that we all have something to learn. And everyone, I did fail kindergarten and have to go through T1, and you are seeing why. It is so interesting that if we don't face the real, that we can't be that point of new creation that Cheaton is bringing out. And I think those could, that starts to get, like, as Cheaton asks in his paper, like, what is at stake with ignoring Nietzsche or not taking Nietzsche seriously? And it could be this choice of why can't I say it? It gets stuck on my tongue every time. like the choice, that seems to be the choice, which would then also be what's at stake is falling into a thinking of realization that leads to entropy. And it makes me think of that point, and then I'll give it to you, at the start, where at the center of a black hole is this great brightness, the brightest thing in the universe. You just have to get through the black hole to it, which would almost suggest that the real is similar. Like at the center of the real, maybe it's this kind of apathetic God, like in the center of the real is actually the source of the opposite of entropy, the source of life and creativity, but we have to face it. Whereas if we don't, we're going to end up in a counterfeit that looks like creation of realization, but really it's a kind of counterfeit in this context. Now, that doesn't mean realization is always bad. It just has to be ordered in a manner that is not avoiding the real. But it's interesting to think that facing that negativity might be the only way to create new life. And then it would make sense then that if education today is to be new, it would center on facing the real, where arguably so much of college is what? Realize your potential, realization, being who you want to be, like doing, like making a difference. There's actually so much of the traditional college model is in fact orbiting a language of realization, where what's going on at like Philosophy Portal is how do we face the real? And then, of course, the irony would then be is that the traditional academic model could be in that way contributing to entropy, whereas work that's being done at, say, Philosophy Portals, these new online communities, is more on facing the real, and that actually being how you unleash neotropy. Perhaps the difference between facing the real and realization is another way to kind of frame the difference between these educational models.
Yeah, I think that's I think it's really important what you're bringing up, and definitely shout out to Chitan for his contribution to Abyssal Arrows. It's a really a fantastic paper, and I definitely want to include it in my teachings, and I'll certainly be going back to it and citing it in the future. But yeah, he brings up this really important distinction, which is probably not as well known as it should be. It also comes up in systems and subjects as this distinction between entropy and negentropy. And I do think, but and this is really, I think, a precise engagement that you're identifying here with Deleuze and Zupancic, which of course Chitan brings up, where basically it's like, yeah, ultimately, Chitan's arguing, and I think Alenka Zupancic will also argue, that Deleuze kind of avoids the real and replaces it with a realized ontology, and in some sense at that point obfuscates the nature of the subject as a consequence of that, and that has real consequences. And so a lot of what Chitan's trying to do, I think, with his engagement with Nietzsche and his use of Zupancic, is that actually Zupancic has a creative rereading of Nietzsche, which in some sense emphasizes it's more emphasizing the tension of the two as opposed to the multiplicity of Deleuze. And this tension of the two for Zupancic is really about helping us understand the way the subject can advance contradiction as opposed to realizing ontology. So it's more about advancing contradiction as opposed to like coming up with an ontology we all agree about, or we focus on, like you're saying, the temptation of manifestation and the spiritual circles and stuff like that, in sort of the denial or the obfuscation of the real. And there is this sort of paradox between entropy and negentropy that comes here, where in some sense, again, yeah, facing the negativity is the way you create the new order. Facing the negativity or thinking through the contradictions is the way in which you can create new order. And you can't predict, or you can't know precisely what that new order will be. Like I've been emphasizing throughout this talk, it's kind of like the best we can hope for is, as it were, setting the constraints where we can be positively surprised, as opposed to sort of, I would say the alternative is to be negatively blindsided, right? Like, so like if you're just focusing on spiritual manifestation, if you're just focusing on realized ontology, then, the metaphor I've always given is that it's very likely that you're going to be, as it were, metaphorically hit by a bus on the side of the road, right? Like you're just going to be blindsided by some negativity that you hadn't thought, or you've been like purposely not thinking. right? Like it's just like you've been repressing something basically. And so, that's going to have the return of the repressed. It's going to sort of, I think what's at stake here in thinking the tension of the two, and Zupancic here is someone who's trying to think Nietzsche and Zarathustra as and this is sort of, I'm inspired by them as well in terms of how I develop my articles in Abyssal Arrows, is like Zarathustra is not a character which is fully knows himself. Zarathustra is not a character where everything is realized. Zarathustra is not a character in which the game is over and then he won or something like that. Zarathustra is constantly in a tension with himself, right? And I think what's implicit in the book is that you're getting insight into what that inner tension, that inner antagonism is. In some sense, Zarathustra is a figure of tension. Zarathustra is a figure of, but also Zarathustra is a figure of that the tension or the contradiction does not come to a null result. The tension or the contradiction does have a positive result, right? And so ultimately here, I think what an education here that at least that for me I think is important to teach is that yes, facing the real involves confronting difficult negativities, facing the real involves thinking through difficult contradictions, but it doesn't come to a negative result. It doesn't come to a null result. It comes through a potentially positive result, which you can't predict in advance. You might be able to anticipate certain positive results, but you're never going to have a complete knowledge of the positive result. And in some sense, that's good. Again, in some sense, an ode to the positive result being something which includes within it surprise. Like, I mean, and then I'll pass it back to you, is like, when, like, if you think about some of the things that bring the most joy in life, I always go back to the example, I think it's a good example, is if you go back to, for example, Christmas morning as a kid, right? Christmas morning as a kid is a good example of a positive surprise because there are constraints in place. Christmas morning is coming, right? It's not like you don't know Christmas morning is coming. Christmas morning is coming. But you don't know, so that's the constraint. But you don't know as a kid what you're going to be surprised with, what Santa's quote unquote is going to bring on Christmas morning, or what fun you'll have with your family, or what in, of course, a positive in a positive situation, in a positive condition. And I think just using that example as an analogy is that what we're thinking about is, in some sense, how do we build containers and structures in education and encourage the style of thinking where we can have more Christmas mornings, so to speak. And what I mean by Christmas morning is certain constrained situations where we can expect positive surprises. And I think that that's, in some sense, what even Zarathustra himself confronts in the book is that, in some sense, Zarathustra's Christmas morning is occurring at the very end of the book, where he's kind of bombarded by a cloud of love, and he's in some sense experiencing what he could call the metamorphosis of the child. So that's that's where I'll leave that.
Well, that was very well put. And I think going into the paradox and it being not null, but there actually being a negation, sublation, creation that come out of that, I think Tim Adlin, when he was talking about paradox and spiritual leadership, indeed, I think we need to think about like leadership today as some sort of guiding of contradiction, not realization of going into the real and living with the real that inherently brings about an accepting of the real. And that's, of course, very difficult, especially if, in some respects, your entire socioeconomic order has kind of moralized realization. And if you start to feel the difficulty of the real, that means you're going the wrong way. And that right there kind of suggests some of the stakes that are going on. I mean, and that also speaks to why Nietzsche warns about ethical systems and morality, and you can get into beyond good and evil. Like in a world where it's good to realize and evil to face the real, you need to go beyond good and evil per se in order to actually, well, be the spirit child, right? Which alludes to Dimitri. So I think what, what Tim Adlin's great paper talks about is really important. It also makes me think, I'm very taken at the beginning of part 4, the very beginning, where Zarathustra, they ask him, hey, are you concerned about your happiness? He's like, no, I'm concerned about my work, not happiness, but my work. But then he goes on to say that he does have a happiness, but the happiness is like tar. And he says, well, maybe like honey. But I really like the language of tar because it's kind of like sticky and heavy. And I think very often people who like face the real, there is this question of, isn't the point of life to be happy, right? Like, isn't that what it's all about? And there's something that what Zarathustra is saying is that the only way to be happy is for happiness to be sticky like tar, which means that as you face the real, your happiness doesn't go away. It sticks to you. Whereas if happiness is not sticky and it's something that is realized, that when the way he also will talk about the animals, start talking about the waves of despair. No, not the animals. When the boys got like the shaman, it is like the waves come of despair. It's gonna
the soothsayer, right?
Yeah, the soothsayer. That's right. So the waves are they're gonna knock off your happiness because it's not sticky, right? So you need something sticky as you face the real. And I think that is what happiness is. Like we could make distinctions between happiness and joy. Like happiness is a byproduct of a work. That the doing of the work is what makes the happiness sticky. And thus makes the happiness not come off, and you carry it with you. It's kind of like that Lewis thing I always reference, where if you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. Like you have to put the work of the real first, and you get happiness also. But if you put happiness first, you don't even get a work. Like you lose both. And then you just kind of suffer boredom and a kind of emptiness. But then that would require a kind of spiritual leadership and a kind of thinking that takes seriously what Zarathustra is doing. And I do like in Layman Pascal's essay, where he kind of talks about some of the things that describe what Zarathustra is highlighting to read from his essay. He says, the tragic, the negative, the embodied, the terrestrial, the material, the descended, the finite, the morally complex, the skeptical, the surreal, the inescapable, the disunified. And those categories of thought kind of go against what traditional education is in the business of, and certainly are categories of the real versus realization. And I would also, now at the same time, what's very interesting is the real entails the realization of the real. But if you just focus on realization, you lose both because you don't even have a real that's being realized. That's the C.S. Lewis principle again. Like in the same way that Mr. Ebert has talked about how there is being and becoming, but not necessarily becoming and being, you get both. Likewise, talking about the real will also lead to something like a realized ontology that is tragic and that considers the role of multiplicity and difference in concert with that reality. But the danger could be to put second things first and emphasize realization, and then you never have to face the real. And in fact, the realization of the real can start to be associated with going the wrong way. You're doing something wrong. Because if we associate enlightenment with feeling good, then when we don't feel good, we could start to think we're going in the wrong direction, right? So it's really important to have a guide like Zarathustra who's constantly undergoing negativity, who's constantly undergoing difficulty, so that we know that, oh, wait, like quote unquote enlightenment is not something that feels good. In fact, it's something that is always challenging you, but it is precisely by facing that negativity and challenge that you can make your happiness sticky. And if it's not sticky, it's going to get washed off. But there's all that negativity. And then, of course, that brings like Pamela's essay on Eros and thinking about Nietzsche as a bringing out Eros, where Eros is pretty scary, man. You start letting Eros come out and like making you alive, and you try to be a spirit child, and frick, nobody understands you and everyone thinks you're out of order and what the heck are you doing? Well, if you can face that scary, that fear, that negativity, you can realize that kind of energy that Pamela is bringing out with the different arrows. But you see, I guess a way to put it, and then I'll give it back to you, because I'm now thinking about also like the practice of blood writing that Max talks about, right? Like if you engage in this practice of blood writing and actually do the practice of like facing your true self in writing in front of you and you bleed on the paper, like we to do some kind of work like that to be able to handle the release of arrows. to be able to be leaders of paradox or to be spirit child. Like, one of the problems is when you hear spirit child, it's tempting to think of like the golden emperor sitting on like the Buddha statue. It's like, ah, yes, the happy child. When really a child, to kind of emphasize some of Michelle's poetry or thinking, a child is pooping, a child is crying, a child is like difficult to handle. They want to play tag at midnight. They want to like suddenly make a fort out of the kitchen, in the kitchen, out of the kitchen utensils during dinner. I'll let you guess if that's based on a story, something that happened. This kind of live sort of let's go, let's go, let's go. And the key then is to figure out how can we be children who are not childish, but Nietzschean children, right? This distinction, as we talked about in our talk between you, when Michelle and I, when we talked about marriage and all that, like the childish versus the child. Well, something like the blood writing that Max is talking about would be on the side of being childlike versus childish. Then the leaders that like Layman Pascal is noting some of the characteristics, or Tim Adlin is bringing out, all of those would be examples of guiding people into being childlike, so that Eros could be a creative energy versus something that's leading to entropy. But that would require then you would need an educational way of doing thinking and education that is in service of that. Otherwise, I think our happiness will not be sticky. It will be something that is washed off as soon as the first wave hits us.
Yeah, I mean, this distinction you're making, but specifically on happiness, and I would definitely encourage people who are interested in that distinction to check out the first page of the fourth and final part, where I think Zarathustra is talking about that. I mean, the distinction I was playing with in my paper with that distinction was the distinction between Zarathustra's fruits were ripe, but he was not ripe for his fruits. Whereas, sort of like, take that to be like the difference between, let's say, quote unquote, individual enlightenment and quote unquote an enlightenment which is for the other. And in the fourth and final part there, what I take to be like what you're describing as the thick honey is like where Zarathustra's finally ripe for his fruits. So it's not just that his fruits are ripe, but he's ripe for his fruits. And there is this sort of way in which I think if you put happiness before work, you're putting the proverbial cart before the horse. Whereas if you put work before happiness, and you sort of say, what matters my happiness? I strive for my work. That the happiness comes on its own, and it comes in a way that, like you're saying, is sticky. It sticks with you. It's not something that you need to constantly revive or constantly, as it were. It's not ephemeral, right? There's a certain solidity. There's a certain and it's precisely, I think, because you're not aiming for that. It just comes. You become ripe through the work. You become thick through the work. I think, and so that's definitely, and it's certainly, I can, I have some relationship to this feeling in my body of, I see it almost like related to the blood. Like I see the honey as related to the feeling I have of the blood in my veins, I just feel, as it were, thick, and I think that's an interesting way to think about it. And again, I think Zarathustra does a good job of articulating that. And yeah, I mean, yeah, the theme throughout. I mean, Tim Adlin, Layman Pascal, they're both pointing at the type of leader which is, I think, committed to, including the tragic, including the negative, including the morally complex, including the disunified. I know that's something that, for example, on Layman Pascal's side, I think he's done a really good job of embodying that within his communities. I think he does sort of not only sort of intellectually articulate this, but I think he also embodies it in terms of how he often functions as bridges between different communities. And then Tim, for example, I think he's, of course, younger than Layman, but he's certainly someone who's trying to bring out the multiplicity of voices, and holding sort of a more profound container for truth, than currently exists. And I think in sort of working through those contradictions in his practical life, that's kind of reflected in his essay. And also, Tim has some critical things to say about Nietzsche in regards to, and Zarathustra in regards to, does Nietzsche or does Zarathustra really hold that space for the other? Does Zarathustra hold that space for the voice and the multiplicity of voices? And that's I suppose something which also gives you an example of the way in which the anthology is critically engaged with Zarathustra as much as it is positively engaged. And then I'll just say, in regards to Max's essay on blood writing, I mean, I think that the practice of blood writing, I've been talking to Max a little bit about how maybe his interpretation of, or his invention of blood writing is like a philosophical version of psychoanalysis. Like, so instead of like psychoanalysis where you're just going in with an analyst and you're, in some sense, you're free associating, I think that what Max is trying to do with blood writing is in some sense bringing that ethos and bringing that spirit into philosophy. So I'll be interested to see how that develops, but certainly it's very the Nietzschean spirit to write with blood. And that's a great example of like, does the university have the capacity to hold that energy? Does the university have the capacity to build those spaces? I think those are the types of things on a very practical level, which would be interesting to experiment with, where people actually discover a method and start to work with a method that might not be possible to work with inside the university, but which could be worked with for the purpose precisely. And because like, when we're ultimately talking about giving birth to oneself. When we're talking about giving birth to oneself, well, it's like I say on the description of the book, it's bloody messy, right? So you need, like, and birth is bloody messy, to emphasize some of the aspects that Michelle's bringing up in regards to Thus Spoke Motherhood, and some of our discussions about marriage and children, and the pooping and the fort making and all of that fun stuff, right?
No, absolutely. And, as you were speaking, it is interesting. Like blood writing is almost, that would almost be an example of how the real gets you to realization. It's almost like there's a difference between realization and then realization with like a hyphen, real hyphenization, where you're realizing out of the real, or with the real, versus realizing away from the real. And in blood writing, you're like, as a writer, you're creating or realizing something by facing reality. And that's like going into the black hole and finding the bright center. That's like the work of making the abyss bright, if you will. And that seems really important. I'm also thinking, as you were talking, it's almost like you have to earn your childhood. Like, we all think we have childhood, but in Nietzsche, it's like, no, you have to earn your childhood, and only an adult can be a child in a funny way. Like, it's only the adult that can be the child. And then the question is, like, what would a university system be that like helps people earn their childhood? And also, as we're talking, that makes me think of a few lines from Mr. Cox's wonderful poem in there, The Mountain Flood, where he says, "But if irrigation premature, the noble soul cheats waters of the flood, and breed instead domestic parodies of what those mighty steeds could yet bring forth." I really like that because it also suggests timing. There's something about timing that's really important. And that also would speak to how there is an experiential element to being Zarathustra, and then timing, of course, Javier Rivera's work. But then I think we also make a mistake to think that wisdom is a matter of experiences. Just if you're older, you're going to be wiser, right? Like, if you have gray hair, you're wiser. But what we're seeing here is that you have to be facing the real, so that the clock could be ticking of you gathering what you need to be able to actually be like Zarathustra, or to be the spirit child, to use Dimitri's wonderful language. And that would require kind of a daily practice of blood living, like blood writing, right? This kind of blood living, which is facing the real, and then creating containers online. Like, universities would basically have to create containers where people could do that work, where they could face that work. And maybe it's kind of funny, like a lot of elementary schools in America or different things will have discipline problems. They'll say, oh, we can't keep the kids learning. We can't, we can't discipline them. They won't pay attention. It's almost like we have to choose between facing the negativity of the subject, or if we don't, it's still going to come out and it's not going to be productive. It's still going to be suppressed and people are still going to be like going to frats, doing crazy stuff or whatever, or people will use that stereotypically. There are a lot of actually frats can be opportunities for real growth in people. It just depends. But the point is, like, it's like, I guess you're almost seeing that if you don't face the real, oh, there's still going to be chaos, but it's an unproductive chaos, as opposed to, it's almost like the difference between being chaotic and facing chaos, maybe. There's some sort of like, if you don't face the chaos, then the chaos takes over you and then destroys institutions. Whereas if you can learn to face the chaos or the black hole, maybe there is something chaotic about a black hole in the sense that it sucks you in and you lose control and you're pulled in, right? Where if you don't face that, then you can't have the negative, sublative, bright abyss in the center of it that could come out. And that then makes me think, I guess, Mr. Ebert's wonderful work on absence and excess, where then precisely because we try to make the chaos absent from institutions, we kind of like pull it out, that then it kind of takes over and it's very destructive. Whereas if we face it and kind of excess the chaos of the real, then it actually gets an equilibrium that we can handle. And then we can negate sublate it into a new level of kind of, well, now how do we create with this chaotic real? How do we make with it? And it's like, how do you make an institution? And then what happens in facing the chaos, you get a dialectical relationship between excess and absence, to use the title of his piece. Whereas if you deny the chaos and try to, quote unquote, make it absent, well, then it destroys you because you haven't put it in a container that can reach an excess of it that then can be, in a sense, created with. So the spirit child creating with it, then create a new equilibrium by which the institutions could operate from. So that, like, if you don't face it, and instead you pretend like it's not there, we don't need the real, we can just have realization, well, then it becomes destructive as opposed to facing it, and then you can work with it. But then, of course, it's scary to work with it. But that's what needs to be done if we're going. And then that makes me think of your talk, and then I'll give it back to you. We'll say Kevin and Daniel, and what does it mean to think of young men or marriage or these different, like, these tensions where we haven't wanted to face the chaos of marriage, of child rearing, or masculinity, or femininity. We haven't wanted to deal with the messy births. So then everything's just messy. It's almost like you choose between messy birth, or everything gets messy, everything gets chaotic, and people then suffer what some have called like the meaning crisis, or some of the sort of downcast, what's the hope of the future, et cetera, so forth. So it's interesting to think that if we don't, and then I'll give it to you, like if we don't have a messy birth, then we're just going to make a mess of things. And that's kind of what we've tried to do. We've tried to avoid messiness, and as a result, we've missed out on the messy birth, and now everything's just a mess, ironically. So we have to think of better containers for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, I mean, one of the things I just want to say is that, something that just keeps hitting me in waves or surprising me in some sense is like the power of that metaphor of the child.
Yeah.
I think that's a good example where, rereading is really powerful, because you're like, because even like, for example, we just say, say someone's never read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, they know about the metaphor of the lion, the camel, and the child. It's like, on one level, it can seem simplistic and trivial, but like the more you reread it and the more you stay with the idea and the more you like work with the idea in your experience, it's like the more legs that idea has and the more profound that idea becomes. And I see that idea spreading all over the place in my work. Like I was teaching about that, and all this time I'm staying right now with at Owen's place in London, and I've been hanging out with Raven. And I find myself returning to the metaphor of the child again and again, whether it's thinking the tension between the biological child and the cultural child, thinking about the child in relationship to sexual relationships and dating, and like the way in which, like in our current concept of dating, usually men and women are too hyper fixated on the other sex, and they're not thinking about the position of the child in relationship to the sexual relationship, right? And that sort of, usually like when you're in those situations and you point out sort of this distinction is like something profound tends to click into place. So there's something about the child as a signifier, and also here quoting Alenka Zupancic, she says the whole point of analysis is to find a signifier that works. And I think that in some sense with the child, like increasingly I find like the child it's not like a universal signifier it's going to work in every situation, but it is a powerful signifier that can work for many people in certain situations. And I think if we don't think it, then I think that oftentimes the child often represents this this facing the chaos of the real, which potentially you could get a new equilibrium and work with that mess, you know, that you've been highlighting so much. I think the child fits very nicely there as well. And again, I think I want to emphasize that this could be clearly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he's talking about birthing the spirit child, which of course, like as you mentioned, Dimitri's whole article focuses on that. And in some sense, Alex Ebert's whole article focuses on that as well. And, you know, emphasizing that it's the apex of spiritual development in some sense. And I like the point that you were making there of, you know, the real paradoxical aspect of the child is that you have to earn your childhood and only the adult can be the child. And I think this is the difference between the child of immediacy, which is the child of immediacy is the child which psychoanalysis deals with. The child of immediacy is the child of the impotent body. You know, we all come into this world with an impotent body. We all come into this world, we take it for granted that the child has to learn how to take a shit. The child has to learn how to walk, right? The child doesn't have basic control over its motor functions, right? And this impotence is something that we all wrestle with, and that's again the point of psychoanalysis, is to come to terms with this child in some sense. But the mediation of the child towards the child that Nietzsche's talking about, the spirit child, is in some sense the being that has learned how to deal with the impotent body. It's carried a heavy load. It's been willing to take the risk of trying to figure out its desires in the world, which always come with hazards and dangers. You know, this is why the lion is always in a battle with the dragon, and the lion is searching for a treasure. And it's not clear that the lion knows what the treasure is. It just knows that there's a treasure at stake here. But it doesn't really know what the treasure might be. Again, coming back to this positive surprise. And so the child is fitting in there as basically the child is in some sense a well-earned immediacy, an immediacy at the end of a mediation. And an immediacy which is always seeing the world with fresh eyes and always capable of saying yes to life in the face of faceless negativity. And I like thinking about that as saying yes to life, this yes to life as a spiritual disposition, not just saying yes to every opportunity that comes along or everything that exists, like, you know, nothing silly like that. But it's kind of like the spirit itself is an affirmation. And in the face of a faceless negativity. So this is I think at least how I read the child, and I think Alex Ebert, obviously his work on excess and absence, I do think that the road to the child is ultimately working with this intimate unity between excess and absence. If I was to bring it back to what I was talking about with the impotent child, it's like the child lacks. Right? Like the child lacks, like, and be very precise, the child lacks a functioning body. The child lacks basic motor coordination skills. The child lacks the capacity to eat and defecate. Right? This is a child lacks. And so it's basically like working, and of course there's the excess of growth itself. And so this relationship between excess and absence is, I think, basically what's being mediated towards the immediacy of the new child. And if we don't think about this, and I don't think we are thinking about this, and at the same time, there's so much potential and so much opportunity to move from a world which is basically people reproducing unconsciously. And I think that's the whole reason why we needed psychoanalysis, is that people were reproducing unconsciously. But if we could move to a world where now we're moving into a world where people aren't reproducing, but at the same time, we're moving into a world where people aren't reproducing, we're simultaneously getting a gift, which is that we're gaining the possibility to think through or mediate reproduction so that we could reproduce consciously, which doesn't mean that we can absolutely predict a better families, but I think we create the condition of possibility for better families. So I'll end with that. I think that's really what's at stake, is, and that's to me where more and more my thinking is going, is can we think through using all of the resources of modern philosophy and modern science and whatever that's given to us in the last 200 years since, the French Revolution, let's say, can we think through better ways to engage in the necessities of reproduction and family building? Can that be done? I think that's really, to me, the stakes of all of these projects, and that's where shit gets real. So
I think that's really good. And who would have ever thought that only children can have children? To play off Nietzsche, it's children for Nietzsche who have children, really. And it's also interesting. We tend to think, so everything you were saying, it makes me think of your talk with Daniel and Kevin on this, where Kevin was talking about a period of isolation, and then, Daniel was talking about the different poet, the yogi, the family man, the doctor, all these different things. And it's interesting that we tend to think of a choice as something you do. We have to understand that a choice is the choice of what we will grow in. And if we think of a child is always growing, right? And whatever we choose is choosing what we will grow in, and thus what will inform our growth. And we don't tend to think that. We just tend to think, oh, I'll be a medicine man, not thinking that we'll grow into a medicine man or we'll grow into a yogi. And really, if you take that seriously, then every single choice is the choice of the conditions you will put yourself in that will change you and who you are. And so you want to be very aware of what you're choosing and to make sure you're continually choosing conditions that change what you are and who you are in different things. And we don't tend to think that, because we just think that we're just doing something, but we're actually always growing. And I think the child kind of brings that out. And we're always going to grow into something. And like you were talking about the lion and the dragon, it kind of makes me think how, George Dyke, his piece on self-love, it's very interesting that the reward seems to be a self-love that's not egotism. Which, who knew that was possible? Who knew that you could love yourself and love life and it not be egotistical and selfish, but actually participate in life or kind of observe life? And it would seem to be the child is someone who's able to love themselves, but not be egotistical, because loving themselves is kind of participating in creation and communities and other people. And that also makes me think of how Zarathustra, this came out in your talk with Kevin and Daniel on friendships, like philosophers underthink friendship and the importance of friendship and friends. And it would seem like a child in Nietzsche. It is interesting that he's waiting for his children, not his child. And you would kind of assume that the children would be friends, right? That they'd have relations between one another. And there seems to be also what does it mean to have educational containers that cultivate friendship, and friendship in terms of children, and becoming children and birthing children and raising children together, right? We haven't thought children. And really, I will say this, friendships that cannot last through the emergence of children, a lot of adults will have children and basically their friends will kind of fall offside or they won't make room for their friends. That tends to be a big test. We have to think the child to think sustainable friendships, dang it. We have to think children, and what does it mean to have children and also have friends of whom themselves are Nietzschean children, and making ourselves Nietzschean children. There's a multi-layer operation that is occurring here that we really, really need to think. And it has a lot to do with the real of the child. I really like that. I really like your point on how the child lacks control of their body, and yet that's precisely why they're able to almost exist in this excess of play and creativity and doing kind of what they want. It's like we go, oh, well, they don't have control over their body, so that's why they do this kind of excess of activity, and they can't help themselves but want to just speak continually or stay up all night and do different works. And it's almost like, though, what we do as we get older and get control of our body, we then don't want to be seen as using our body to do things that are seen as excessive. You know, like studying philosophy outside an academic institute. That's a little excessive. It's okay to study philosophy if you're getting a degree, but outside of it, that's a little excessive, right? Why would you use your body to do that? Or to say climb tall mountains, it's like, why would you do that? It's dangerous. What if you get hurt, right? Like, we don't see, like, if you say, oh, I'm going to submit myself. A lot of people are doing jiu-jitsu now. I was speaking with Drew or my good friend Paul, and it's like, because there's something about putting yourself in that circumstance that's good. But why? You'll never be a professional jiu-jitsu person. Like, if you use your body to put it in conditions that are seen as excessive, then you get negativity, right? Because now you have control over your body. But now the child is someone of whom actually uses their body and that control to push it into places of the real and challenge and to put it in excess of itself to reach new equilibriums and to keep moving forward. But it's funny how with the child, they're almost allowed to be in excess because they have the absence of control over their body. Whereas you gain control and it's not absent, the absence then becomes something you're yet to reach. You're yet to be a great jiu-jitsu player. You're yet to climb the mountain. So the absence is that moment that you have to participate in the excess to accomplish. So the location of the absence moved from a lack of inner control of the body to a lack of having done that thing yet. And so you have to actually work with the excess to accomplish that thing, but that's when you're going to face the negativity. I also couldn't help but think that as it's like maybe the difference. It's interesting with books, going back to like, what is the book today for a minute? Like when we think of a seed getting old, we say, oh, it's growing. Like it's good for a seed to get old, right? But a book tends to be something that we think, it's an old book, as in we don't need to read it anymore because it's old. But a seed that's old, that's good. And it's almost like we should think of the book, like if we're going to write a book, an actual book, it needs to be something that grows as it gets old, not something that gets outdated as it gets old. And I think Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or many of the great books, are an example of that grow as they get old, as opposed to become outdated. And so we really need to think like blood writing, all of these different practices are things of like, you know, they're books that grow as they get older. Are we writing books that grow as they get old? And likewise, are we living lives that grow as they get old? We tend to think of a human as someone that as you get old, you stop growing, right? Like you're getting old. But what Nietzsche is saying is like, no, we need to be children, which means as we get old, we grow. Aging becomes growth, but we tend to associate aging with getting old. So the great books seem to be ones that as they age, they grow, not things that get old as they grow. And I think we have to think about like, are we creating freaking educational institutions to incubate that? And I think, frankly, if you do, then, you know, Quinn wrote on Amor Fati, the love of life, and thinking of that, it's like, that's when you love life, because life is in the process of growing. Whereas if life is the process of getting old, then you're like, life sucks. Because you just get old and you die. But when you say, no, life is a process of growing as you get old, then it's something that you look forward to. And then I think it would be easier to be true to the earth, because as opposed to the earth as kind of the place where you return to the dust, basically is how people think about it. As you get old, you're just returning to the dust. And Jason wrote on that, like the truth of the earth and different things. Well, then I think you start thinking of life as something that you grow through, as opposed to as you lose as you age. I think we think of life naturally as something you lose as you age, as opposed to something you gain as you age. Which then, if you think of life experience, and maybe that's part of thinking of growth as gaining intelligence. As you get old, it's harder to remember things. You're not at school anymore, so you're less intelligent. But if we put more emphasis on experience, well, then that's something you gain with time, right? And then I'll hand it back to you. It makes, like when you're speaking the child metaphor, what's so interesting is that metaphor seems to grow with time. You know, that's the point. Like it doesn't get old with time. It's like it's growing with time and it's gaining more character with time. And that seems to be good writing. That seems to be a good metaphor when something is growing with time. And I think Zarathustra is an example of that. And so then the question becomes, a good education is something that will turn getting older into growth. A bad education, a failed education, maybe a failed education is something that you go through and it doesn't help you feel like aging is growth. It makes you feel like aging is dying, as opposed to a good education is something that makes you feel like aging is growth. And that would start to address things like the middle years, as we've talked about, and the problem of the middle years, and the problem of getting older and not thinking of it just returning to dust. So no, I think the child metaphor is a good example of something that grows as it ages, as opposed to returns to dust.
Yeah, a lot of great points there. I mean, I've been talking to Raven a lot, who's a kind of genius when it comes to evolutionary biology, and she keeps on highlighting this important distinction in evolutionary biology between R and K selection, which is basically different modes of reproduction, where one is more reproduction for quantity and the other is more of a reproduction for quality, or one is more of a short lifespan strategy, and the other is more of a long lifespan strategy in evolutionary terms. And I think that she's emphasizing that our society has become very R selected, which is very focused on basically living the life of a musician or reproducing like a musician, as opposed to a K strategy, which would be, say, more, I guess, thinking about long-term quality. And when it comes to just putting that into connection with your idea about good education is getting older into growth, is that it just makes me think about, I think we do need to think, and I think in some sense, I think, of course, both men and women would benefit, but part of me thinks that women in particular would benefit from if we create an education where the idea of getting older is growth, as opposed to like the being in this sort of culture where we're endlessly trying to preserve youth. And a lot of women think that they need to preserve their youth eternally, as opposed to seeing getting older as part of a positive growth. And that might be an important piece of the puzzle in regards to thinking about the child in its biggest context.
To that, I'll have to read this little part out of Jason's paper where he makes the point where we tend to think this hour of our contempt, the change from pain as a function of the body to pain as a function of the spirit. I think we have to think of like aging that way. We think of aging as a pain, but really aging becomes kind of a function of the spirit for its growth and the opportunity of the growth. And then same way with, like you're saying, with females, like we tend, like, so much is like, oh, I'm losing my beauty. Oh, I'm losing what I had when I was younger. Well, then it's just a function of pain. And we don't see in our culture pain as a function of spirit. So it's all negative, and that doesn't, and I'll give it back to you, that contributes greatly to thinking of aging not as growth, but aging as loss. So I thought Jason had a nice line on that.
Yeah, no, Jason's paper is great. And just to point out, like, I think what Jason's playing around with is important, because he is bringing in, I think, some interesting evolutionary literature, and he's trying to think about, becoming, and trying to think about the Overman as from the perspective of the becoming of evolution itself, and thinking about evolution self-reflexively. So that ties in really well to thinking through new societies, new reproduction strategies, new families. I often thought that one of the greatest ironies of history was that the fundamentalist religious people reproduce better than secular evolutionary people. Is that's one of the greatest paradoxes of and ironies of history. So I think that what the challenge is there is actually the people who have let's say understood, let's say, the evolutionary worldview. I mean, in some sense, people like that need to get more serious about what it means to participate in evolution, right? And to participate in reproduction, and to participate in family building, and to participate in that life. And does evolutionary theory, this is a very open question, does evolutionary theory give us the intellectual tools to think through the family and to think through reproduction in a way that is better than a world where we didn't know about evolutionary theory? That's just an open question. Like, does that, and it seems to me like it hasn't really been asked that deeply. right? So I think there's a lot of paradoxes there between evolution and religion, which is ripe for new thinking. Yeah, I know I guess that's something that will interest me moving forward in my thought anyway. But yeah, just to maybe to bring it to a close, I think I just want to say that I really like what you're emphasizing about this paradox of only children can have children, and of course in the sense of, not in the negative sense of children having children, this would be the unconscious reproduction, but children having children in the sense of of course, the Nietzschean sense of the child, which would be people having children because they've consciously decided that they want to give the next generation a better life, and they're shooting for the Overman, so to speak, and they see the family and they see reproduction as part of the becoming of the Overman, as Nietzsche will say in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So yeah, I guess to end, I mean, I'll just sort of say that you know, I see this this work, Abyssal Arrows, as a type of philosophical midwifery, where not only are we focused on the idea of the child, which I think is so central in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but like this is really giving birth to, I think, future, not only future subculture, future community, future university structures, all of that stuff, but also future philosophical minds. There are people here contributing in this work who are still giving birth to themselves. They're still young. This is like part of what could become their future doctoral theses or something like that. And at the same time, there are people in this anthology who are further along in their intellectual development, and they're contributing to the future of a subculture. They're contributing to the future of leading the way. So I think there's going to be a lot in here for anyone who picks up the book. There's a lot in here for everyone. There's a lot of diversity, but there is at the same time a through line in the book. And I think that through line does revolve around this giving birth and this child and being inheritors, being part of a tradition of Zarathustra's children, and being the types of philosophers, being the types of spirits that Nietzsche would have loved to be around in his day. So I'll end with that, and I just want to say one more time, thanks so much, Daniel, for everything you've done, whether it's behind the scenes or explicitly on the screen. So thank you.
No, I've enjoyed it immensely, and I really like this thought of have we benefited from the idea of evolution, and I'm wondering what, you know, a lot of people religiously interpret evolution as a kind of negation, but what would the negation of the negation that would be an affirmation kind of that Quinn talks about, and and certainly everyone needs to pick up a copy of Abyssal Arrows. You can find it on Amazon. All reviews are deeply appreciated. And if anyone could do that, it would mean a lot. You can write a review under the order history. You just go to your order history and to the right, it says write a review. And that really, really helps. If anyone could do that, we'd really appreciate that. And I really appreciate all your work, Cadell. Everything you're asking is, to me, just like the critical questions that need to be asked today, and studying these great books to help us think. And I'll just close with this, that in the book that Quinn brings out, from Nietzsche, to quote Nietzsche directly, we give birth to our thoughts out of our pain, and like mothers, endow them with all we have of blood, heart, fire, pleasure, passion, agony, conscious fate, and catastrophe. Life, that means for us constantly transforming all that we are into light and flame, also everything that wounds us. We simply can do no other. And I think Philosophy Portal is a wonderful example of an institution and scene, to reference the language from Theory Underground that I like so much, that is doing just that. So thank you for everything you do to make that possible. And thank you to all the contributors. I highly suggest all their essays. I suggest the work. I've learned a lot from them. I've learned a lot from you, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak on Abyssal Arrows. And again, it was a pleasure to work on, to be part of, and thank you all who contributed. And thank you so much, Cadell, for your time today. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Just gonna say, subscribe to OG Rose, follow OG Rose work, all that stuff. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. And Abyssal Arrows, pick it up, Amazon, and as Daniel said,
pick it up.
If you pick it up, leave a and you enjoy the work, leave a review. Very helpful and fantastic. I'll end there.
Thank you, Cadell.